No one expected Capricorn Clark's first day working for Sean Diddy Combs to begin with a death threat, but according to her sworn testimony on May 27th, 2025, that's exactly what happened. She'd been hired through a headhunter to assist one of the most powerful men in entertainment, but instead of a welcome meeting in a boardroom or a flashy music studio, Diddy invited her to Central Park after dark. She wasn't alone. With them was a man known as Uncle Paulie, described by Clark as someone with the stature of a linebacker and an ever-present pair of blackout shades. This wasn't just an employee orientation. This was an initiation into something far more ominous. Clark testified that during that walk, Diddy turned to her and said if anything ever happened, especially because she had previously worked for Suge Knight, he might have to kill her. The courtroom fell silent. When the defense objected, the judge overruled it. The jury heard every word. That moment set the tone for Clark's career. It wasn't just about branding or marketing. This was survival. Clark had come from respected industry roles working with Def Jam, Death Row Records, and eventually Diddy's Empire. She was no stranger to high-pressure environments, but nothing prepared her for the culture of fear and intimidation she would describe over the next several hours of testimony. Her role started small shadowing Diddy, then transitioning to head of women's at Sean John, and finally global brand director for Diddy's personal brand. But as her proximity to Diddy grew, so did the psychological manipulation and control. She said Diddy regularly surrounded himself with enforcers, men like Uncle Paulie, D-Rock, Roger, Bonds, and Ruben, each playing a role in his operation surveillance and at times intimidation. At one point, Clark even described seeing Diddy with a gun inside her own home. She recalled him telling industry figure Chris Lighty that he had a weapon because he had a problem with 50 Cent. The casual nature with which he referenced firearms alarmed her. Then came the false accusation Clark was accused of stealing jewelry she claims was gifted to her or on loan. When the item went missing, everything changed. Diddy's machinery kicked into high gear, and Clark found herself in a spiral she couldn't escape. Uncle Paulie interrogated her for hours, searched her home, and eventually transported her to a location she later described as a dilapidated building at 1710 Broadway. It was under construction. She hadn't been told that, and it looked more like a site for an ambush than a workspace. On the 6th floor, behind a locked door, a heavy-set man awaited her, chain-smoking, cold, unnamed. And soon Clark would realize she wasn't just being questioned, she was being detained. She was told she would be taking a lie detector test, but this wasn't law enforcement. This wasn't formal HR protocol. This was Diddy's personal justice system. The heavy-set man reportedly told her if she failed, she would be thrown into the East River. And this, according to Clark, was just the beginning. What's most chilling is that this wasn't framed as a threat to extract justice, but rather as a way to exert absolute psychological domination. She wasn't just afraid of losing her job, she was afraid of losing her life. Despite the chaos, Clark returned to work the next week. There was no apology, no explanation, just more work. And from that moment forward, the lines between corporate loyalty, emotional abuse, and psychological warfare became dangerously blurred. What would make someone stay in that situation? Clark said it clearly: if she left, they'd think she stole. The image is almost cinematic, except it's real. Capricorn Clark locked in a room on the 6th floor of a deteriorating building in Midtown Manhattan, staring down a stranger who told her flat out, "If you fail this test, we'll throw you into the East River." But this wasn't a movie script. This was the account given under oath in a courtroom filled with gasps and stunned expressions. Clark's story of captivity during her employment under Sean Diddy Combs unfolded like a psychological thriller. She described being held for 5 days, 5 entire days. No police, no calls, no freedom. Every morning the same routine, more wires, more questioning, more lies veiled as loyalty checks. This wasn't about truth. It was about breaking her spirit. The building 1710 Broadway was under renovation at the time. She had no idea. As she entered, Uncle Paulie led her to a single locked room. A folding table sat in the middle like an interrogation prop. And the man conducting the test, Clark described him as 5 of me. Massive, chain-smoking, no name, no credentials. She was told she had to pass a lie detector test, an illegal one administered by a man who operated outside the boundaries of any certified system. Clark says the man threatened her repeatedly. If the machine couldn't get a good reading, she'd be disposed of. It didn't matter whether she was guilty or not. Uncle Paulie came and went throughout the ordeal, occasionally checking in, but never once offering her a way out. On the contrary, he reinforced the situation, serving as the constant reminder of who was really in control. No food schedule, no access to a lawyer, no consent. It went on for 5 days. What's more disturbing, Clark didn't tell anyone. Why? Because she was under a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, and more importantly, because she believed that surviving meant staying silent. Every instinct told her this wasn't a test to find the truth, it was an intimidation ritual to prove loyalty through fear. She returned to work as if nothing happened. The job resumed, waking Diddy up in his townhouse on Park Avenue, following him to Daddy's house recording studio, keeping track of meetings, managing events. She said on a good day she got 4 hours of sleep, on bad days 2. She developed a stress-related medical condition from the constant surveillance pressure and lack of rest. And the financial compensation, $55,000 per year, that's right. For a role that demanded 18-hour days, round-the-clock access, and being subjected to interrogations and illegal detainment, Clark was paid barely above entry-level salary. When she raised the issue with Human Resources, she said they confirmed she was owed more than $80,000 in unpaid overtime. But when she brought that to Diddy himself, he ripped up the documentation. In her words, he just tore it up right in front of me. Hotels were another battleground for emotional manipulation. Clark was sent ahead to book room stay with Diddy or clean up afterward. She was told to watch TV and order room service while Diddy hosted private meetings with women, including Cassie and Kim Porter. Each room had recurring items in Diddy's bags: baby oil, lube, cameras, small bottles. She was never told what to do with them. She was just expected to act like it was normal, clean up any spills, dispose of anything that could raise questions, keep her mouth shut. He even used fake names to check into hotels: Frank Black, Frank White. The women used pseudonyms too, Jackie Starr, among others. It was all highly orchestrated. She watched as relationships like the one with Cassie grew darker. She saw Cassie summoned, given orders, insulted, and dismissed. In one incident, Diddy reportedly mocked Cassie in front of others, saying, "That's why you don't have a man." When Clark defended her, Diddy turned his verbal abuse toward her, and then came the drugs. Clark testified that she was routinely asked to obtain ecstasy and Molly for Diddy, including in Europe and the south of France. She said she refused to get cocaine for him, referencing her own mother's death from addiction as the reason, but ultimately she did procure drugs through intermediaries, including a Spanish security guard. In perhaps the most damning moment of this section, Clark revealed that Diddy used her name to acquire prescription drugs. They were stored in the toiletry bags she carried or given to security for safekeeping. She also moved bulk cash for him, stacks of $100,000 at a time. Money, she says, came from European club gigs and appearances. This wasn't a job. This was servitude disguised as employment. And it wasn't just mental abuse, it was institutionalized control. Despite everything, she didn't quit. Because if she left, she believed her reputation would be destroyed. And in the music industry, where silence is currency and loyalty is enforced by fear, that was enough to keep her in line. Until the night things took a much darker turn. Everything changed in December 2011. Capricorn Clark's testimony took a sudden and horrifying pivot when she described the night Diddy showed up at her apartment armed, enraged, and ready for violence. It started with a phone call. Cassie Ventura had begun secretly dating Kid Cudi, a fact Clark had learned when Cassie brought him to her apartment. Clark knew it was dangerous. After all, Diddy paid for both their phones. He monitored them. So Clark advised Cassie to delete any trace of the meeting and even helped her buy a burner phone from Best Buy, a desperate attempt to keep the romance secret and survive the fallout. But Diddy found out. On the morning of December 22nd, 2011, between 5:30 and 6:00 a.m., Clark was startled awake by a violent banging at her door. Through the peephole, she saw Diddy disheveled pacing, holding something metallic in his hand. A gun. He entered without permission. He was wearing a button-down sweater, torn pants, and fury in his eyes. He demanded, "Why didn't you tell me who is Scott?" Clark denied knowing anyone by that name, but Diddy wasn't buying it. He said he was going to go kill this N-word, referencing Kid Cudi. When Clark tried to object, he snapped back, "I don't give a fuck, it's what you want. Get dressed." She complied. In the Escalade waiting downstairs was Ruben, one of Diddy's security men, sitting silently in the driver's seat. Clark sat in the back next to Diddy gun, still resting on his lap. They drove to the Hollywood Hills to Kid Cudi's house. On the way, Clark, desperate, used the burner phone to warn Cassie. She told her Puff is at Cudi's house. She even changed Cassie's contact name in her phone to Stormy, her best friend, in case Diddy checked her device, a calculated act of self-preservation. When they arrived, Diddy and Ruben stormed inside. Clark stayed in the car, watching helplessly. She could see them moving through the house. The tension was unbearable. Then Cudi pulled up in his black Porsche. Diddy saw him and shouted, "There's that N-word right there." The situation was moments away from erupting into a deadly confrontation, but instead of chasing him, they got back in the car and drove off, crossing paths with a police car headed toward the house. The danger wasn't over. At the Key Club later that morning, Diddy forced Clark to call Cassie and deliver a chilling message: "He has me and won't let me go." Cassie, calm and resigned, simply said, "Okay, come get me." Clark was driven home by Rubin, but the psychological captivity remained. The next day, Diddy ordered Clark to convince Kid Cudi not to file a police report, so she and Cassie drove back to his house and begged him to stay silent. Clark recalled telling them Puff came to my house with a gun. If you tell on him, he'll hurt us all. Cudi was reportedly mind-blown, but that wasn't the end of it. That same day, Clark testified she witnessed the most violent act yet. Diddy physically assaulted Cassie in the street, not behind closed doors, but out in the open. Cassie, curled up in the fetal position, was silent sobbing. Diddy kicked her repeatedly. Onlookers Rubin and Clark did nothing. Clark said Diddy turned to her and threatened, "If you jump in, I'll fuck you up too." Desperate, she called D-Rock and Uncle Paulie, pleading with them to intervene. Neither did. She then called Cassie's mother, Regina Ventura, and told her flat out, "He's beating the Bible out of your daughter. I can't call the police, but you can." Why couldn't she call? Because their mission of the day, Clark said, was to handle Cudi. That meant no police, no attention, no headlines. This wasn't just fear, it was strategy. Later, Cassie emailed Clark warning her that Diddy was threatening to release tapes about her and that he might send someone to hurt her or Scott Kid Cudi. Clark didn't respond. She couldn't. She just wanted it all to end. Eventually, law enforcement did call, but not for her protection. It was the arson investigators. Cudi had apparently given them her name. Clark hung up. She didn't want to cooperate. She didn't want to risk retaliation. But the threats didn't stop. Clark testified that Diddy told her more than 50 times that he should kill her. He said he should mutilate her. He said he'd make her off herself. D-Rock, his loyal enforcer, would echo those threats in the background, doubling down. She turned to Harv Pierre, the president of Bad Boy Records, for help. His response: "That's crazy, but it's going to be okay. No action, no protection." Then came the final insult, a termination notice. Officially, she was fired for not properly submitting a vacation request, despite having email proof that she did. She lost everything: her health insurance, her 401k, her house, her car. When she tried to rebuild her life, Diddy allegedly blacklisted her. Job offers vanished, prospects dried up. People didn't want to be associated with her. She was radioactive. This wasn't just abuse, it was career assassination. And still the cycle wasn't over. Capricorn Clark's return to Diddy's orbit wasn't a redemption, it was a warning. After all the trauma, after the violent episodes, after being blacklisted and abandoned, she returned to work for him in 2016. Why? Because no one else would hire her. The silence of the industry was deafening. She was damaged goods. The same machine that had elevated her career was now erasing her. In her own words, "I needed people to see I wasn't disposable." That line alone speaks volumes about how deeply entangled her identity, survival, and dignity had become within the world Diddy controlled. But her new position wasn't a fresh start. It was surveillance by another name. She was now managing Cassie's public image while Diddy retained final control over everything. From photo approvals to fashion shoots, nothing moved without his blessing. Clark played the role of brand director, but it was always understood that Diddy had the final word, even from a distance. And Cassie Clark observed her spiraling further into dependence emotionally, financially, and chemically. She was taking more drugs, Clark said. She was still dating Diddy. The pattern had not only repeated, it had calcified. In 2023, something shifted. Cassie filed her civil complaint against Diddy, and even though the complaint didn't mention Clark, it broke something inside her. Clark said she was traumatized by the complaint. That's when she retained an attorney of her own. And then in an unexpected move, she reached out to Diddy directly. Her message was blunt: "I want my life back. You kidnapped me." Yes, she said that in writing. And still, there were discussions about her possibly working for him again as chief of staff, as if none of it had happened. Why would she even consider going back? Because sometimes in abusive power structures, the only option victims feel they have left is proximity. If she was close, she could protect herself, control the narrative, and maybe build a future on her terms. But even then, it was a house of cards. She hadn't spoken to Cassie since 2018. She hadn't spoken to Scott Kid Cudi since 2012. The past had buried those connections, but the emotional wreckage remained. The defense during cross-examination tried to paint Clark as an opportunist. They highlighted messages where she allegedly said she had a crush on Diddy. They pointed out that she wanted to work with him again. They tried to frame her as inconsistent, as someone leveraging old drama for new relevance. But those attempts to undercut her credibility only emphasized the complexity of trauma. Survivors don't always flee. They don't always behave in linear ways. Sometimes they return to the fire because the world outside offers no warmth. The court heard more about how Clark had once helped run Diddy's Vote or Die campaign, how she was instrumental in artist development, how she dressed Cassie like David Bowie for a photo shoot. They heard how she helped Cassie get a record deal with Epic Records, how she handled drug runs, how she dressed wounds and scrubbed hotel rooms clean. In one flashback, Clark recalled helping Cassie get a burner phone. "You can't do this on your bad boy phone," she warned. She wasn't just an employee, she was a handler, fixer, a guardian playing roles no one had asked her to, but that she took on anyway out of necessity. She said that after Diddy returned from a trip to Kazakhstan, he somehow got into her secured apartment building. The security guard was later fired. She described the layout, the sequence of events, the sound of footsteps in the hallway. And when the Porsche pulled up, the one driven by Cutie Clark's anxiety reached a breaking point. She knew that Carr's appearance could ignite something irreversible. They chased him, then lost him, then crossed paths with police, and still she returned to pick up Cassie, and still she went to Cootie's house to convince him not to report the incident, and still she stayed quiet when Cassie was being kicked in the street like garbage. Clark testified that she called the fire investigator assigned to a separate arson case linked to the drama but hung up. She didn't want to be involved. She didn't want her name in any more reports. She just wanted peace. But peace, it seemed, was a luxury she couldn't afford. Even job offers from outside the industry, like one from Chris Lighty, disappeared. He died the day before she was supposed to start. She was left with no income, no reputation, no support. At Interscope Records, she was told to leave Puff alone. That wasn't legal advice, that was survival advice. And in the end, she returned to work for Diddy. Not because she wanted to, but because she felt it was the only way to prove she still mattered. Because in Diddy's world, you're either useful or invisible. Capricorn Clark's testimony ended not with justice, but with resignation. The final chapters of her experience are not the satisfying conclusion of a survivor reclaiming her life. Instead, they serve as a grim reminder that power protects itself and that even when the truth is told, it doesn't guarantee freedom. By 2024, she was back in touch with Diddy. Her attorney, Brian Friedman, had reached out. They discussed employment again. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. How could someone who claimed to have been kidnapped, threatened, and blacklisted ever consider returning to the same man who had orchestrated it all? That's the question the defense wanted the jury to focus on. They read texts where Clark admitted she once had a crush on Diddy, referred to him as chalk short for chocolate, and seemed starstruck by his presence. But none of it erased what she described under oath 5 days locked in a room, drug trafficking under coercion, threats of violence, financial destruction, and the systematic dismantling of her professional reputation. The contradiction is the point. Abusers don't always look like villains. Sometimes they wear designer suits and fund orphanages in Kazakhstan. Sometimes they give you opportunities before they take everything away. Clark said it best herself during the final stretch of her testimony. "At this level of business, I thought I could be his protector. I tried to keep professionalism as the goal." She wasn't just trying to survive, she was trying to manage him. She believed that if she stayed close, she could act as a shield for others. Cassie, staff, maybe even Diddy from himself. It's not an uncommon dynamic in abuse cases, especially when careers, identities, and survival are entangled. Victims don't always escape the first time, sometimes they don't escape at all. During cross-examination, the defense tried to pin her timeline down. They questioned the timeline of her firing and rehiring. They asked why she never formally reported the alleged kidnapping. They challenged her silence after witnessing the assault on Cassie. But trauma is not a straight line. It doesn't conform to neat timelines and legal language. It bleeds into everything. And Clark bled for years. She testified about her autistic son, about how with no parents and no backup, her stakes were higher. She wasn't just working for Diddy. She was clinging to the last thing that offered her stability, even if it came with a price. By the end, it became clear that Clark had been running on fumes professionally, emotionally, spiritually. The music industry had turned its back on her. Job offers disappeared. Industry insiders warned others not to associate with her. Her story had become toxic. And even when she had a new opportunity lined up like the one with Chris Lighty, it vanished. Lighty died the day before she was set to begin. It's the kind of tragic detail that would feel forced in a fictional script, but in the courtroom it only served to highlight how relentless Clark's downward spiral had been. She told the court that she returned to work for Diddy in part so that people would see she wasn't broken, that she still had value, that she was not disposable, but the truth is she had already been disposed of. Quietly, efficiently, like so many others who spoke out against powerful men and were met not with support, but silence. Her final statement hit harder than any headline. "I was blacklisted." A single phrase, but it captures the industry's complicity, the consequences of speaking out, and the enduring fear that no matter how loud you scream, no one will listen if the person you accuse has more power, more money, and more lawyers. Even now, there's no guarantee that Clark's testimony will lead to legal accountability, but what it has done, what it must do, is force the public to confront the human cost of silence. Because when a woman says she was kidnapped, threatened, and erased and still shows up at work the next day, that's not weakness. That's a system working exactly as designed. Capricorn Clark's testimony is more than a shocking headline. It's a disturbing map of what unchecked power looks like behind closed doors. She endured threats, captivity, blacklisting, and watched violence unfold in silence. Why? Because survival in Diddy's world came with impossible choices. She stayed loyal to stay alive. She told the truth to be heard. But now it's no longer just about her. How many more names are still hidden? Now you know. The question is, what will you do with the truth?